The front gate was swinging in the wind when I arrived, and I stopped before stepping onto the path. My grandmother, Celeste, treated every evening like a carefully planned routine. She watered the flowers before sunset, checked every window, locked every door, and placed the gate latch in exactly the same position every night. Seeing it wide open in the middle of the afternoon felt so wrong that I could not convince myself it was a simple mistake. My name is Eliana, and until that day I believed my grandmother lived one of the quietest lives in our town. She had retired after teaching music for almost 40 years, and people remembered her for her kindness more than her talent. Children waved when she walked to the bakery. Neighbors stopped to ask about her roses, and every Sunday afternoon she played the piano with the windows open so the music could drift across the street. Nothing about her life suggested mystery or danger, which was why my father's phone call sounded impossible. He told me Grandma Celeste had disappeared. Nobody had seen her leave. Nobody knew where she had gone. The police believed she had walked away during the night. They found no signs of a struggle, no broken locks, and no missing valuables. Her handbag remained beside the front door, her reading glasses rested on the kitchen counter, and her walking shoes were still neatly arranged beneath the coat rack. According to the officers, elderly people sometimes left home without telling anyone, especially if they became confused. My father accepted that explanation because he wanted something that made sense. Most of my relatives did the same. Grief often pushes people toward the easiest answer because certainty feels less painful than doubt. I could not accept it. People sometimes mistake an explanation for proof. The English word assumption means believing something is true before enough evidence exists to support it. My grandmother often reminded me that patient thinking begins by questioning assumptions instead of protecting them. Those words returned to my mind while I stood quietly inside her hallway, looking at the familiar house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Everything appeared normal. The old clock continued marking each passing second with its steady rhythm. Fresh lavender filled the living room, and a knitted blanket rested across her favorite chair exactly as it always had. A cup of tea stood beside the chair, still half full. The surface had cooled, but the tea had not completely dried around the edges. Someone had expected to return before finishing it. That thought stayed with me, because it matched the woman I had known all my life. My grandmother never abandoned unfinished tasks unless something more important demanded her attention. Relatives began arriving throughout the afternoon. They hugged one another, spoke quietly, and discussed practical matters. Some wondered whether stress had affected her memory. Others believed she had become lonely after retirement. Nobody questioned the police report because accepting it required less emotional effort than imagining something more complicated. I listened without arguing. 3 days earlier, my grandmother had corrected my pronunciation while we practiced the lyrics of an old Italian song. She had remembered every verse without opening the music book, laughed when I missed a difficult word, and promised we would continue practicing the following weekend. Nothing about that afternoon suggested confusion or forgetfulness. Instead of joining the conversation in the kitchen, I walked toward the music room. It had always been my favorite place inside the house because every object reflected her personality. Shelves filled with records covered one wall, carefully labeled notebooks lined another, and a polished piano stood beneath the largest window. Warm sunlight crossed the wooden floor, making the room feel peaceful despite everything happening outside it. At first, I noticed nothing unusual. Then I looked at the piano. Its protective cover remained open. That detail immediately caught my attention because my grandmother never left it uncovered overnight. She believed dust slowly damaged the keys, and she treated the instrument with almost the same care she gave her garden. I walked closer and saw a single page of handwritten music resting on the stand. The composition stopped halfway through the final line. Several notes had been erased but never replaced. That detail disturbed me more than I expected because she often said unfinished music sounded like an unanswered question. She refused to leave any melody incomplete, even if she disliked the result. I reached toward the page but stopped myself. Learning English becomes easier when we train ourselves to observe carefully. The verb notice means recognizing something important that other people may overlook. Strong readers do not simply move through a story. They pay attention to patterns, repeated details, and small changes because those details often shape the meaning of everything that follows. I decided to examine the room the same way my grandmother had taught me to study music, one careful note at a time. Near the piano bench, I found an old silver key. It was heavier than I expected and beautifully polished despite its age. There was no tag, no chain, and nothing nearby that matched its shape. I searched every cabinet and drawer in the room without disturbing their order, but I found no lock that accepted it. While replacing a stack of music books, I noticed something else. A thin layer of dust covered almost every shelf except one narrow space near the center. It looked as though a book had been removed only recently. I searched the room for it but found nothing missing. The empty space bothered me far more than the mysterious key because someone had either taken the book or hidden it somewhere else. Unlike the key, the missing book represented a fresh change rather than an old secret. That difference mattered. The front doorbell interrupted my thoughts. When I returned to the hallway, my cousin Adrian was speaking with two police officers preparing to leave. One officer politely explained that they would continue monitoring nearby towns and would contact us if they discovered anything new. His confidence sounded professional, but I noticed something unusual while he spoke. His eyes never moved beyond his notebook. He never asked about the music room. He never asked whether anything inside the house had changed. After they left, I watched their car disappear beyond the trees and realized they had been investigating a missing person without first understanding the missing person's life. Context often matters more than isolated facts. The word context refers to the circumstances surrounding an event. A single clue rarely explains a mystery, but several connected details can completely change our understanding. My grandmother had spent years teaching me that music only makes sense when every note is heard together instead of separately. That evening, most of my relatives returned home. My father asked me to stay at his hotel because he did not want me spending the night alone, but I gently refused. I needed one quiet evening inside the house before strangers packed away her belongings and ordinary memories disappeared beneath practical decisions. After darkness settled outside, I made tea using my grandmother's blue teapot and stood silently in the kitchen. While waiting for the water to boil, I noticed a folded envelope hidden behind the final page of the wall calendar. There was no stamp or address, only my name appeared on the front. Inside rested a single handwritten sentence. "If I disappear, do not believe the first story you hear." I stared at those words until the kettle began to whistle. For the first time since arriving, I stopped wondering where my grandmother had gone. Instead, I began wondering who wanted everyone else to stop looking. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. I read the note again before carefully placing it inside my notebook. My grandmother had never been dramatic, and she certainly never wrote mysterious messages to attract attention. Every sentence she wrote had a purpose. If she had expected to disappear one day, then she had also expected someone to misunderstand what had happened. That realization changed the way I looked at everything inside the house. Instead of asking where she had gone, I started asking what she had wanted me to find. I returned to the music room with the silver key still resting in my pocket. The missing book continued bothering me because it represented the only object that no longer belonged where it should have been. Every other shelf remained perfectly organized. My grandmother believed that order reflected respect, so even the smallest change inside the room deserved attention. I studied the bookshelf more carefully and noticed faint scratches running along the wooden panel behind the empty space. They were almost invisible unless the sunlight struck them from the side. I gently pressed against the back panel, but nothing happened. Then I remembered something my grandmother often did while teaching children to play difficult songs. She would never force the piano keys. She always searched for the correct touch instead. I slid my fingers slowly across the edge of the shelf. A quiet click echoed through the room. The back panel moved only a few centimeters before stopping. Behind it rested a narrow compartment containing a leather notebook wrapped inside a faded blue cloth. The notebook looked old, and the edges of its pages had turned slightly yellow with age. There was no title on the cover, only a small gold symbol shaped like a treble clef. Learning becomes more meaningful when new words appear naturally inside a story. The adjective careful describes someone who pays close attention and avoids acting too quickly. Careful observation often reveals details that impatient people miss. My grandmother believed that solving problems required patience long before intelligence, and I finally understood why she had repeated that lesson throughout my childhood. I opened the notebook expecting to find personal memories. Instead, I found dates. Every page listed different places, train schedules, weather conditions, and short observations written in my grandmother's neat handwriting. At first, they seemed completely unrelated, but after reading several entries, I noticed one name appearing again and again. Helena Brooks. The name appeared more than 20 times. Sometimes it stood beside a date, sometimes beside a location, sometimes beside only one sentence. Still waiting, I turned another page. No letter today. Another page. Someone asked about Helena. I said nothing. The entries stretched across nearly 15 years. Whatever connection existed between my grandmother and Helena, it had lasted far longer than anyone in the family had ever imagined. As I continued reading, a folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the floor. It described a railway accident that had happened almost 25 years earlier in another part of the country. Several passengers had survived, but one young woman listed in the report had disappeared before rescuers finished searching the area. Her name was Helena Brooks. I read the article twice. According to the newspaper, Helena had never been found. That made no sense. If Helena had disappeared decades earlier, how had my grandmother continued writing about her for another 15 years? Questions were beginning to replace answers. The notebook had revealed one truth while creating 3 new mysteries. Before I could think further, someone knocked firmly on the front door. This time it was not a neighbor. A woman wearing a dark blue jacket introduced herself as Detective Naomi Pierce. Unlike the officers who had visited the previous day, she carried no notebook in her hands. Instead, She quietly studied the house before speaking. "I apologize for arriving without notice," she said. "I reviewed your grandmother's case this morning, and I realized something had been overlooked. I invited her inside. She walked slowly through the hallway, paying attention to the photographs hanging on the walls instead of immediately asking questions. That small detail made me feel she understood people before she judged situations. I heard your grandmother taught music," she said. "She did. Then perhaps you can explain something." She removed a clear evidence bag from her briefcase. Inside lay a small metal train token. "We found this beneath the driver's seat of your grandmother's car." I stared at it. It looked almost identical to the symbol inside the leather notebook. "I've never seen it before," I admitted. Detective Pierce watched my expression carefully. "I believe you." Her answer surprised me. Most investigators I had seen on television questioned every statement with suspicion. She seemed more interested in understanding than accusing. "The strange part," she continued, "is that this token belongs to a railway company that stopped operating nearly 20 years ago." The room suddenly felt colder. I looked toward the notebook hidden beneath my arm. The old train schedules, the railway accident, Helena Brooks. None of it could be coincidence anymore. Context gives meaning to information that otherwise appears disconnected. The noun connection refers to the relationship between two or more ideas, people, or events. Strong readers improve their understanding by asking how separate details influence one another instead of treating every clue as an isolated fact. I realized I was no longer collecting random objects. I was slowly uncovering connections my grandmother had carefully preserved. Detective Pierce noticed me looking toward the music room. "May I ask you something?" she said gently. "Of course." "Did your grandmother ever mention someone named Helena Brooks?" The question caught me completely off guard. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "No." She nodded thoughtfully. "I expected that. Why?" She reached into her briefcase once more and removed an old black and white photograph. It showed 3 young women standing beside a piano after what looked like a concert. I immediately recognized my grandmother. I recognized Helena from the newspaper clipping. The third woman remained unfamiliar. "There should have been 4 people in this photograph," Detective Pierce said quietly. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the empty space beside my grandmother. The original photograph included another person. I looked closer. She was right. Someone had been carefully removed from the picture. Not crossed out. Not hidden. Cut away completely. Detective Pierce met my eyes before speaking again. "I think your grandmother disappeared because someone has finally come back looking for the person who no longer exists in that photograph." Detective Pierce placed the photograph on the dining table and waited for me to study it again. The empty space beside my grandmother was impossible to ignore now that she had pointed it out. The edges where the 4th person had been removed were clean and deliberate. Someone had taken great care to erase that face without damaging the rest of the picture. My grandmother had hidden Helena's story, but someone else had erased another person completely. "I found this photograph in the town archive," Detective Pierce said. "The original concert program listed 4 performers, but every official copy now shows only 3. That does not happen by accident." I thought about the notebook hidden inside the music room and the newspaper clipping describing Helena's disappearance. "My grandmother knew all of this," I said quietly. "I believe she did," Detective Pierce replied. "The question is why she spent so many years protecting it." We walked together into the music room. I decided there was no reason to hide the notebook any longer. Detective Pierce examined each page carefully without interrupting me. She read every entry twice, paying close attention to the dates and locations. When she reached the final pages, she stopped. "There is something different here." I leaned closer. The last few entries were no longer observations. They looked like preparations. "She is coming home. The promise ends this week. If anyone asks, let Eliana decide what should be shared." I stared at my own name for several seconds. My grandmother had known I would be the one searching for answers. Good readers understand that the meaning of a story can change when new information appears. The noun perspective describes the way someone sees or understands a situation. At first, I believed my grandmother had disappeared without warning. Now I realized she had carefully planned every clue because she wanted me to see the truth from her perspective instead of accepting the simplest explanation. Detective Pierce closed the notebook and looked toward the piano. "May I ask you to play something?" I looked at her with surprise. "I haven't played in years. Please try." I sat on the piano bench and placed my hands gently on the keys. The unfinished sheet of music still rested on the stand, exactly where I had found it. I played the opening melody slowly, remembering the lessons my grandmother had given me as a child. The notes flowed naturally until I reached the unfinished section. Then I noticed something. The erased notes were not mistakes. They covered tiny letters written beneath the music. I lifted the page carefully. The hidden letters formed a short sentence. "Check inside the metronome." My heart began beating faster. The old wooden metronome still stood on top of the piano. I turned it over and noticed a small compartment hidden beneath its base. Inside rested a single envelope. Unlike the others, it had already been opened. Detective Pierce unfolded the letter while I watched. The handwriting belonged to Helena Brooks. She explained that she had spent many years living under another identity after witnessing financial crimes involving powerful people connected to the railway company where she once worked. Disappearing had protected her life, but it had also forced everyone who loved her to remain silent. My grandmother had agreed to guard Helena's identity until every legal investigation had finally ended. The promise had lasted almost 25 years. Helena's final letter explained why my grandmother had disappeared. She had received official confirmation that the case was finally closed. For the first time in decades, Helena could return home using her real name. My grandmother had gone to meet her at the railway station before telling anyone else. She wanted her oldest friend to walk through town without fear. Tears filled my eyes as I finished reading. Everything suddenly made sense. The hidden notebook, the missing book, the train schedules, the coded music, the silver key, none of them pointed toward a crime. They protected a friendship built on extraordinary loyalty. Loyalty is a valuable quality that often appears in stories and real life. The noun loyalty describes continued support for someone, especially during difficult times. Loyalty sometimes requires patience, sacrifice, and silence. My grandmother had never hidden the truth for selfish reasons. She had protected another person's future until it became safe to reveal the past. Before either of us could speak, my phone began to ring. The number was unfamiliar. I answered with trembling hands. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then I heard the gentle voice I had been hoping for since the day I found the open gate. "Hello, my sweet girl." My eyes filled with tears. "Grandma? I knew you would find the clues," she said warmly. "I also knew you would wait until you understood them before judging anyone." I smiled through my tears. "Where are you?" "At the old railway station," she replied. "Someone very important has finally come home." An hour later, Detective Pierce drove me there. The station looked peaceful beneath the evening sky. Near the platform stood my grandmother. Beside her was an elderly woman whose smile carried both happiness and regret. I recognized Helena immediately from the photographs. The two friends embraced me together, and for several moments nobody needed to explain anything. Some reunions speak more clearly than words. As we walked home together, I finally understood the real mystery. My grandmother had never wanted us to search for a missing person. She wanted us to discover the difference between disappearance and sacrifice. Many people believed she had walked away from her family. The truth was that she had spent 25 years walking beside a promise that could only end when an innocent friend was finally free. Looking back, I realized the story had never been about fear or deception. It had always been about trust, patience, and the quiet courage required to keep a promise long after the rest of the world had forgotten it. Only then did the title of her final message become perfectly clear. She had never truly left. She had simply returned to the place where an old promise was finally allowed to end. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.